In almost any other country, the murder of more than 100 politicians would send shockwaves around the world. But in Mexico, this is the brutal reality of life in the country's general election. More than 100 politicians and candidates have been assassinated, and hundreds more dropped out since election season began in September. In one of the most violent countries in the world, running for office can be a death sentence. Last year was Mexico's bloodiest year on record. More than 29,000 people were murdered. That's an average of 79 people being killed every single day. Cartels are intimidating and punishing anyone who dares to stand up to them. So why is there so much violence in Mexico's politics? Welcome to So What, the series looking at stories you should know more about. Subscribe to our channel to keep up to date with our videos. And if you found this interesting or know a story you think we should be covering, leave a comment. In this video, we're going to look at the huge rise in violence around the national elections in Mexico and why this year looks like it's going to be the deadliest in the country's history. So what's happening in Mexico? On July the 1st, the country went to the polls to throw out the ruling party and elect the first left-wing leader in decades. But it was an election characterized by extreme violence. Cartels have been burning politicians' homes in broad daylight. One candidate was shot in the head in public as he posed for a selfie. Almost every political party has been affected, and it's all part of a wave of intimidation and corruption. More than 600 politicians withdrew from the race, fearing for their lives. So why is all of this happening? Mexico is no stranger to brutal violence, especially around the time of elections. But this year has been particularly bad, and it's mainly down to two things. The first reason is that this was the biggest election in the country's history, with more than 3,400 seats up for grabs. To help us understand this, we chatted to Dr. Benjamin Smith from the University of Warwick.
You've got effectively three levels of elections. You've got federal level elections, so for the president, gubernatorial elections, so for the state, and then you've got local elections for the municipality. Now, usually these have been held over the president's 6-year term. For this year, they've started to hold them all at the same time. Murders which would have been spread out over a presidential term have been concentrated in the last year or so.
For the gangs and cartels, elections are the perfect time to exercise their control over local officials. That often means murdering those who vow to tackle crime, paying off potential threats, and intimidating others into standing down. In one town, the entire police force was arrested on suspicion of murder after a mayoral candidate was killed. That's how deep the cartels go.
The line between the political party and organised crime is zero. There is none. Political control has come absolutely key to their operation.
But why has there been such a huge rise in the last few years? To understand this, we have to go back to the start of Mexico's war on drugs and the history of the drugs trade. Although low-level drug smuggling had existed throughout the 20th century, by the 1970s, due to massive demand from the United States, it has skyrocketed.
It really got going after the counterculture in the 60s and 70s. And from the 70s through to the 80s, the state effectively controlled drug trafficking. Now, this was pulled apart in 1985, so this has kind of spread the drug trafficking organizations throughout Mexico.
This huge rise in drug trafficking created cartels, huge criminal organizations dedicated to smuggling, money laundering, and murder. By 2006, the President Felipe Calderon had called in the army to fight the cartels. That signaled the start of Mexico's war on drugs. And this is one of the reasons why things have got so much worse. His tactic was to go after the kingpins who controlled the biggest gangs. But when the bosses were killed, imprisoned, or extradited, it unleashed a whole new wave of violence. It created a vacuum where the big cartels split apart in the fight for control.
Around 2000, you had about 4 major cartels. Now you've got about 9 major cartels and around 200 semi-autonomous organized crime groups.
So will the election actually change anything? This is where a large amount of Mexico has hope. President Manuel Lopez Obrador has said he's going to fight corruption and violence.
En comprometernos a que terminemos con esa corrupción, con ese cáncer que está destruyendo al país.
One of his ways of doing this is by redistributing wealth to reduce poverty. This could stop poorer Mexicans turning to organized crime. Another way he could change things is by creating an amnesty for gang members.
This is a kind of radical change in the kind of political compass of Mexico. He knows there are hundreds of thousands of Mexicans who, one way or another, have got involved in elements of organized crime and want protection from prosecution in order to kind of extricate themselves from this.
Lopez Obrador hasn't said exactly how he's going to implement his policies. And while long-term reform could help reduce the violence and corruption, it doesn't show any signs of stopping in the short term. Lopez Obrador will have to try and fix a situation that many think is unfixable.
¡Viva México!
The hope is that drug trafficking organizations will, instead of murdering candidates, will basically attempt to make deals with the candidates that have won. It's really what's going to be important is the first 2 years of Lopez Obrador's tenure, whether he can put in place and implement his policies to try to improve the security situation.